Donald Trump's position towards Ukraine and Volodymyr Zelensky has changed dramatically, and Laura Loomer and even US Vice President J.D. Vance played a role in this. Today, July 28, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, arrived in Washington, where he is meeting with Donald Trump in the Oval Office of the White House. And this time, the meeting will be held without the press, behind closed doors. But after that, Zelensky will also address the senators who are finally expected to pass the law on sanctions against Russia. According to American media, the relationship between the two leaders, Trump and Zelensky, is now, quote, stronger than ever. And this is a sharp contrast to what it used to be. Everyone still remembers the February 2025 scandal in the Oval Office, when Trump and Vance, in front of the cameras, were scolding Zelensky and basically won. They kicked him out of the White House. What has changed over these months, and why did Trump eventually turn toward Ukraine? The answer, strangely enough, lies not only in diplomacy, in fact I would even say not in classical diplomacy at all, but in the world of MAGA and bloggers, boxing nights, and Ukrainian interceptor drones with the interesting name Pisyun. Today, we'll break it down in detail in this episode, what each side expects from the meeting of the two presidents. How has Donald Trump's position been influenced by the changes of his own allies, from MAGA blogger Laura Loomer to Vice President J.D. Vance? And how is Kyiv systematically winning the sympathies of the Trump movement? And how can this MAGA movement actually help Ukraine? This is actually an interesting story with a lot of curious insights about how Ukraine is conducting a fairly competent campaign to capture the attention of Donald Trump's supporters, who have always been labeled as toxic. My name is Alexei Peichi. Let's discuss this whole topic together, in particular Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to Washington and his meeting with Trump. But before we start, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. We are moving towards the 300,000 subscribers mark, so I'd be grateful for each and every subscription. The President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has already arrived in Washington. Let's start with why Zelensky came at all, and what he himself called the main purpose of this visit. The official reason for the visit to the United States of America is a memorial ceremony. Zelensky came to pay tribute to Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who died on July 11 at the age of 71 from complications of cardiovascular disease. Zelensky considered Lindsey Graham one of Ukraine's main allies in the Senate, and shortly before his death he visited Kyiv. But of course, the funeral, as strange as it may sound, is just a pretext. The main events are happening and will continue to happen in the Oval Office of the White House. Zelensky made his priority clear as soon as he arrived in Washington, and here is his quote. Already in the United States of America, the schedule includes a meeting with President Trump, his team, and those who can support our defense. Priority number 1 is missile defense and strategic cooperation with America. Peace must draw nearer. So for Ukraine, the number 1 goal is air defense and anti-ballistic systems. Specifically, on the negotiating table right now are strengthening air defense and licenses to produce missiles for the Patriot systems directly in Ukraine. And as you know, the main problem here isn't the Patriot systems themselves, no. But it's the constant shortage of interceptor missiles for them. What does Trump want from this meeting? Here, the two sides' positions differ slightly. And this is important to understand because on one hand, it looks like we're moving in the same direction. But there's one very important difference. Today, the New York Times is covering it. At this meeting, Zelensky hopes to resume the stalled peace talks and secure more military aid, especially in the area of air defense. And Trump, in turn, plans to discuss ending the war by whatever means possible. And so the New York Times puts it this way. At this meeting, Trump and Zelensky can use each other, each for their own purposes. It's telling that all senators were invited to the talks with Zelensky, all 100 senators of the US Senate. And all this is happening against the backdrop of Congress considering that very sanctions bill by Lindsey Graham. We'll come back to it because a serious scandal has erupted there. But right now, all American media are focused on the moment when Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump meet at the White House. This is happening at 4:30 p.m. Kyiv time. At this moment, all American media are reporting in unison. They are writing that Trump has significantly changed his position on Ukraine, as well as his personal attitude toward Volodymyr Zelensky. And this is clearly noticeable. But the main question is, why? Why is Trump changing his position? And here the Wall Street Journal writes that in recent weeks, Trump, quote, has expressed new optimism about Ukraine and Volodymyr Zelensky. And there are several reasons for such a turnaround. The first reason, the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine. Sources claim that Donald Trump was impressed by Zelensky's resilience and by the fact that Ukraine continues to strike Russian territory. Well, I would say, of course it sounds diplomatically nice, but the point is that Trump, and he actually kind of let this slip on July 8, really likes these strikes on Russia. He says, yes, it's an escalation, but it's escalation that is needed to bring peace closer. And here a very simple but purely Trump-style logic is at work. Next is a quote from a US administration representative. Trump likes winners, and in the opinion of the US president, Zelensky is looking more and more like a winner. And this is the key to understanding Trump. He respects strength and success. While Ukraine was losing, he treated it with disdain. As soon as Ukrainian strikes on oil refineries, depots, and weapons manufacturing plants in Russia began to put Moscow at a disadvantage, Zelensky turned from a supplicant into a winner in Trump's eyes. And if you're on the side of a winner, then maybe you'll get some dividends, because when you come out of a war with a winner, well, you can lay claim to something. That's pure Trump logic. And Trump himself confirms this publicly. And so, commenting on the growing support for Ukraine among some of his supporters from the MAGA movement, he agreed with the journalist's statement that he supports winning. And he said, quote, almost everyone I support wins. The second reason is Ukrainian drones, and we will also talk about them more than once today. The Wall Street Journal reports that Trump has started to show interest in the Ukrainian drone industry, especially after seeing its effectiveness in the context of the war with Iran. That is, the Americans saw how cheap Ukrainian drones accomplish tasks instead of, say, Patriot missiles, and that made an impression, especially considering that the expensive American Patriot interceptors in the Middle East were running out at an alarming rate. It turned out that you could buy an interceptor from the Ukrainians for just tens of thousands of dollars and shoot down Iranian projectiles and drones just as effectively. The third reason, it might sound like a joke, but it's real. And the third reason is boxing. According to the Wall Street Journal, Donald Trump's views were greatly influenced by his meeting with the Ukrainian boxer Alexander Usyk before the UFC fight night at the White House. And that's when Alexander Usyk told the US president that Ukrainians are fighters and winners. He said, look at me, I'm Ukrainian, that's who we are, we're fighters and winners. And that it's better for him to stay close to such fighters and winners, because history has proven that Ukrainians sooner or later beat the hell out of anyone who wrongs them. Moreover, Usyk told Trump about his family's life during the Russian shelling of Kyiv. And he said that the differences between Ukrainians and Russians are in the mind and the heart. Well, as you know, Usyk is quite religious, a deeply faithful person, and they discussed this as well, and this impressed Trump. That's how, through a conversation with the world boxing champion, the Ukrainian position was conveyed to Trump in a language he understands, the language of victory, the language of strength, the language, let's say, of a certain kind of showmanship. And later, Trump stated that he has great respect for Alexander Usyk. And the fourth reason, this is that very story with the MAGA bloggers, which needs to be discussed separately. because it shows an entire strategy, Kyiv's strategy to charm Trump's team. So, Kyiv's strategy in this regard is as follows. They need to win over all the loud and often even scandalous MAGA activists to their side by any means necessary, who are always on Donald Trump's side. As you know, recently, the MAGA blogger Loomer, who has an audience of 2 million followers, arrived in Ukraine. She is an ultra-right activist, close to Donald Trump. She often hugs him and takes pictures with him. And she has already managed to show the realities of the war in Ukraine, interview Zelensky, and document her visit to the Skyfall facility. This is a Ukrainian drone manufacturer. And so Loomer recorded a video at the production facility, which has already spread all over social media. Americans are like, wow, they're amazed. Like, what is this? Is this really happening in Ukraine? That's their reaction. In the footage, Loomer is holding a Ukrainian interceptor drone with a provocative name. Well, it's called P1 Sun. Well, Ukrainians call it Pishun. There. And Loomer is holding this P1 Sun and speaking to the camera, addressing Americans, which is important. Quote, and you may have seen this interceptor drone quite recently.
Hello everyone, this is Loomer. Right now, I am in Ukraine at the world-famous Skyfall facility where they manufacture drones. I'm holding a P1 Sun interceptor drone in my hands. And maybe you've seen this interceptor drone recently because this is exactly the same device that Senator Lindsey Graham was holding just 2 days before his tragic death. Few people know about this now, but actually, Senator Lindsey Graham was celebrating his 71st birthday on the day when he visited the drone manufacturing plant in Ukraine. And as a sign of respect for the senator, since he spent his birthday with them, the company Skyfall used one of its drones to hold a sign that said, "Happy birthday, Senator Lindsey Graham." They were going to give the senator one of these interceptor drones as a gift. In fact, they actually gave him one of those interceptor drones, but no one knew that just 2 days later he would die. And that's why they gave me this footage exclusively, so that I could share them with the American people on the day of Senator Lindsey Graham's funeral.
Also wanted everybody to know.
They also wanted everyone to know they will no longer send that interceptor drone and the UAV itself to Lindsey Graham's house. Instead, in honor of Lindsey's commitment, support for the Ukrainian people, and opposition to authoritarianism, we will send this drone to the front line so that it can be used to destroy Russians. Rest in peace, Senator Lindsey Graham, defender of freedom and human rights around the world.
And this is a super important detail that connects this whole story with Zelensky's visit to Washington today. Loomer dedicated her trip to Ukraine to the memory of Senator Lindsey Graham. Vladimir Zelensky arrived today for Lindsey Graham's funeral. As you may have noticed, it's no coincidence that Loomer was active in Kyiv just the day before. 2 days before his death, Lindsey Graham also visited this same facility. And he was holding the same drone, as it turned out, that Loomer posed with. According to Loomer, the company planned to give one of these drones to Lindsey Graham as a gift. But after his death, as the blogger noted, in honor of Graham's commitment, the drone will be sent to the front line, quote, to destroy Russians. Who is Loomer, and why are even her words so important and can have such an impact? Not long ago, she was one of the main voices in that part of the Trump movement that demanded an end to aid to Ukraine. She called Ukrainians Nazis, criticized Zelensky. In 2021, she even wrote propaganda articles for the Russian propaganda channel Russia Today. And now this woman is going to Ukraine. She films enthusiastic videos with Ukrainian drones and interviews Zelensky at the Mariinsky Palace in Kyiv, after which she publicly declares, quote, "Russia is Nazi, my friend." The New York Times directly calls Loomer a symbol of changing views on the war among part of Donald Trump's electorate. Like other participants in the MAGA movement, she used to be against Ukraine, but now she has done a 180. And Trump, crucially, noticed this evolution in his own MAGA movement. He reposted a fragment of Laura Loomer's interview with Zelensky on his social network and reacted to it positively. And according to the Wall Street Journal, Trump has already discussed Ukraine with Laura Loomer several times in recent days. That is, he called and said, "So what's really going on there?" And what's important is that he listens to her. Because, let me put it this way, there are rumors that she even influenced some personnel appointments in the White House. In that interview with Laura Loomer, by the way, Zelensky was specifically appealing to Trump's camp. He told Loomer how, through the mediation of the Vatican, he reconciled with Trump after that very February scandal in the Oval Office. And he says it happened at a meeting during Pope Francis's funeral, and then his quote follows. "Yes, the meeting was brief, but I have always said that it was a historic moment. After all, in 15 or 20 minutes, we changed the nature of our relationship. There was no one around us. It was just the two of us." But Laura Loomer is not an isolated case, but part of a broader shift in position, which has already reached the very top of the US government. We're talking about Vice President J.D. Vance. The same Vance who, together with Trump in February, publicly scolded Zelensky in the Oval Office and who previously became famous for the phrase, quote, "Honestly, I don't care what happens to Ukraine." This very Vance suddenly started to change a little bit. Even his position started to shift. Vance suddenly started to admire Ukraine's military strategy. Currently, he's cautious to avoid alarming his supporters, but he's shifting his stance. He now says, well, yes, we must admit Ukrainians are certainly very brave. And to hit Russia like that every night, you really need to have balls which only men have. Well, that's exactly why Zelensky is now building his campaign in a Western style, winning over the sympathies of the Trump camp. It's a deliberate strategy. Notice it's not about charming Donald Trump personally, but about charming his entourage, which will then feed Trump the right talking points. Russians, by the way, tried to do the same thing through Kirill Dmitriev, remember him? He brought ideas worth billions of dollars, talked about how they would cooperate, how much Trump would earn from it, how the Russians would shower him with gold. But the Russians didn't succeed. Well, against the backdrop of the meeting between Trump and Zelensky, it would be naive to think that the entire Trump camp suddenly fell in love with Ukraine. Unfortunately, there is a fierce struggle going on inside MAGA, and today, Politico reports that dozens of supporters of the Make America Great Again and America First movements, as well as Trump's allies on Capitol Hill, do not share this sudden shift by Laura Loomer. Republicans in the House of Representatives are especially skeptical, who have actually opposed aid to Ukraine before. Their arguments are tough, even going so far as to accuse Laura Loomer of being bribed. They say it's Ukrainians who are paying her money so that she voices this kind of rhetoric, like, she used to be paid by the Russians, but now the Ukrainians pay her, and she switched sides. Some Republicans connected to MAGA have openly stated that Loomer might be getting funding for promoting her new position on Ukraine. According to them, not a single Republican has actually changed their attitude toward Kyiv. For example, Republican Congressman Tim Burchett said, "I can't speak for MAGA, but I haven't come around to supporting Ukraine." Well, one of Politico's sources put it even more alarmingly, commenting on the influence of foreign interests on right-wing media, meaning those very same ones that support Donald Trump. Quote, "A foreign government and entities connected to foreign interests have infiltrated the right-wing media environment in America. This space is completely out of control." Let me remind you, the right-wing movement includes Fox News. That is, even within MAGA itself, there's paranoia about who is changing their position and for whose money. When asked about the funding of her trip to Ukraine, Loomer herself stated that the Ukrainian government did not cover the expenses for this trip. So, here's the honest picture, and it sounds like this. The turnaround is real. It has reached the top levels, But the resistance within MAGA is huge, and you can't say the issue is completely resolved. So you still need to be objective. And here it's appropriate to mention the second story about how the US is currently formulating its public position on the war. And by the way, this is another point about the shift. At the UN Security Council meeting, the US Deputy Permanent Representative Denminer Negria called on Russia and Ukraine to resume negotiations and reach a long-term settlement.
The Russian
ballistic missile and drone strikes from July 18 to 19 reportedly resulted in the deaths of several people and injuries to dozens of others.
One of these missiles hit a civilian grain ship in the Black Sea, killing 10 crew members from India and Syria. These casualties and countless other deaths could have been avoided if Russia had responded to President Trump's call to negotiate an end to this war. As we have already said, there is no military solution to this war, and Ukraine and Russia must return to the negotiating table. Too much blood has been shed. The world is paying a high price because of this war. It must end. The United States once again calls for an immediate ceasefire, as well as for Russia and Ukraine to negotiate in good faith for a long-term settlement of this conflict.
And notice that Negria specifically emphasized that many casualties could have been avoided if Russia had responded to Trump's call to end the conflict. He put the responsibility for continuing the war directly on Moscow. However, to persuade Moscow to seek peace, pressure must be applied, which is where we face problems again. We're talking about Lindsey Graham's bill on sanctions against Russia. The document provides for sanctions against Moscow and its supporters, and most importantly, tariffs of up to 100% against 5 countries that buy the most Russian oil. Zelensky will be in the Senate today, by the way, once again trying to convince senators to finally pass this long-stalled bill. But here's the paradox. According to the Telegraph, it's not the Republicans, but the Democrats who are now putting support for Ukraine at risk. Despite bipartisan support, the Democrats are opposing this bill, and here's why. It seemed that after the US Supreme Court overturned the Trump-era global trade tariffs a few months ago, Lindsey Graham's bill suddenly became a legal way to give the US president back the authority over those very tariffs. Democrats are afraid that Trump, once he gets this authority, will abuse it just like he did before. Republicans, in response, accuse Democrats of playing politics, saying their clash with Trump could interfere with strengthening. And here we end up in a deadlock. The law that's supposed to hit Russia got stuck because of internal American infighting over Trump's authority to impose tariffs, and the death of Lindsey Graham made everything more complicated. Because he was one of the many voices still pushing Donald Trump toward tougher actions against Russia. Now that voice is gone. And that's why it was so important to gain the support of the MAGA movement, which also has a strong influence on Donald Trump. Conclusion. Zelensky is in Washington, and relations with Trump are at their highest point ever, according to American media. And by the way, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov complained again today that a phone conversation between Trump and Putin hasn't even been scheduled yet. Although the US president promised this call 3 weeks ago, Trump turned toward Ukraine for several reasons at once. He saw Zelensky as a winner because of his successful strikes against Russia. He became interested in Ukrainian drones during the war with Iran. He heard the Ukrainian position from the boxer Oleksandr Usyk, and he saw how his own supporters, from Laura Loomer to in part J.D. Vance, were turning away. How can the MAGA movement really help Ukraine if we manage to actually, well, maybe not everyone, but at least some of them, win over to our side? The answer is straightforward: with votes in Congress. It is specifically the Republican skeptics from the MAGA movement who have been blocking aid to Ukraine and sanctions against Russia for years. If even some of them change their stance along with the mood, as already happened with Laura Loomer, Ukraine gets a chance to push through the Lindsey Graham sanctions bill and licenses for Patriot production and continued military aid. That's why Kyiv is working so methodically with this audience. bloggers if needed, a boxing event, if an interview is needed specifically for the MAGA audience. All of this ultimately translates into real decisions from Congress and the White House. But we need to honestly remember that, for example, even Donald Trump himself is not paying much attention yet to the argument about Russia and Iran cooperating, which Kyiv is using to try to convince skeptics, and the death of Linty Lentigram has deprived Ukraine of a key lobbyist. Therefore, the main argument remains the same and the most significant. The situation on the battlefield. We must make it as hard as possible for the Russians. Ukrainian strikes on Russia have repeatedly put Moscow at a disadvantage. And it is exactly this, plus the position of MAGA bloggers, that impresses Donald Trump the most. In general, at this point, I think, and that's the point we need to keep pressing. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the YouTube channel for updates on Trump and Zelensky's negotiation results, and importantly, Zelensky's speech in Congress. We will immediately sit down and analyze all of this together with you on this YouTube channel. So subscribe, hit the like button, click the bell icon, and write your comments. If you want to support the work of an independent YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. I would be grateful for your support. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.